Hello! In this video, I will go over how to analyze an MR Urogram, or MRU, using pMRI. Our main objective is to calculate split renal function and send the functional report to PACS. We will do this in steps, starting from the very beginning with how to load a case, all the way up to making a 3D functional map. But first, let's look at some useful reference material. The MRU analysis portion of pMRI is based on my previous software, ChopFMRU. You can visit this website for more information. I also recommend reading this article from 2010. It outlines how the various functional parameters are calculated and what they mean, and provides a good overview of what functional MR urography is. Let's get started. I have an anonymized case saved on my local hard drive. I can drag and drop it onto the local studies table to import it. You can also import data from a network PACS connection. This is covered in another video. Once we have the case imported and selected, we need to choose the correct series in the local series table. At my place of work, we use a Siemens scanner, so our T1 GRE sequences are called 3D vibes. If you're using a GE scanner, you will probably load Lava sequences or Thrive sequences on a Philips scanner. Here's a list of some of the various names that different vendors assign to the same type of sequences. So, back to our case. Each dynamic acquisition is its own series, so I need to select all of the dynamics and exclude any MIPS or other sequences that don't belong. Right-click on the selection and choose MRU from the list of options. We should see a progress percentage in the top right corner as the case is loading. Once the case is loaded, we can navigate the images by scrolling with the mouse wheel while hovering over the image. We can also change the dynamic or time point by holding Control while scrolling. Before we start the analysis, let's briefly talk about the data itself. Our dynamic scan lasts about 8 minutes, during which we acquire 32 slices every 10 seconds more or less continuously. Contrast is administered approximately 1 minute into the scan. Make sure that your protocol is set up correctly. For example, if you acquire one dynamic every 45 seconds, this analysis will not work. You can contact me if you want a copy of our MRU protocol, which lists all of these details, including sedation and contrast and Lasix administration. Our main objective is to calculate split renal function. We do this by defining regions of interest, one in the aorta and one for each kidney. In this example, we have a duplication on the left. That means we will have a total of 4 regions of interest to define. One in the aorta, one for the right kidney, one for the left lower pole, and one for the left upper pole. I chose this particular case to look at because segmenting a duplicated kidney is subjective and can get tricky, as we will soon see. Let's start with the aorta. Select the MRU region of interest tool from the ROI tool menu by right-clicking on it or pressing 3 repeatedly. Once selected, double-click on the image to generate a 4D subtraction MIP. Left-click around the aorta on the MIP around the level of the renal arteries. Double-click to finish. Scroll to find the aorta and paint a sample inside the aorta with the left mouse button. You can zoom in and out by holding Z on the keyboard and using the mouse wheel. Double-click to finish. Our aorta segmentation is done and we can move on to the kidneys. We can do them in any order, but let's start with the right for this example. I set my active ROI to right by clicking here. Now I double-click on the image again to begin the segmentation. Just like for the aorta, left-click around the kidney. Make sure you don't exclude any tissue. You can right-click to erase bad points. Double-click when finished. Paint a sample inside the right parenchyma with the left mouse button. Erase with the right. I often zoom in and change the radius of the ROI tool during this stage. I hold Z and mouse wheel to zoom, and X and mouse wheel to change the eraser radius. Make sure you get the entire width of the parenchyma, but exclude the collecting system and portions outside of the kidney. Double-click when done. The right parenchyma and collecting system are now segmented. We can fine-tune our thresholding with the threshold slider and subtract any extraneous regions with the left mouse button while holding X. But this one looks okay. Let's repeat the same steps for the left. The first thing we notice is that we don't have an upper and lower pole ROI to choose from. Let's fix that by selecting left duplication from the MRU settings menu. Now we can set the active ROI to left upper pole. Double-click on the image and click around the pole. Keep in mind that my selection is subjective. The poles are often fused together with no clearly defined boundary. Double-click when finished. Finally, paint a region inside the parenchyma of the upper pole, covering the width of the entire kidney but excluding the collecting system. Double-click when finished. Now comes the tricky part. We need to also segment the left lower pole. We can see from the images that there is a lot of thinning with heterogeneous function. Motion artifacts have a stronger effect too because of the thinning. Due to these factors, I expect that I will need to make manual adjustments during segmentation. Let's begin the same way by first setting the active ROI to left lower pole. Double-click on the image and click around the lower pole. Once again, where I split the poles is subjective, but the software will automatically exclude any overlapping regions with the upper pole from my selection. Double-click when finished. Now we need to paint over some parenchyma in the lower pole. We really need to zoom in and change the ROI tool's radius to do this. Find some functional tissue and double-click when finished. Here we can see that the segmentation went outside of the pole and picked up a lot of background tissue. Let's cut the extra pieces away by holding X and painting with the mouse. I use this technique in combination with the threshold slider to adjust my ROI. Finally, let's get the bladder. Right-click on the ROI toggle buttons and click the excretion button, or press E to toggle excretion mode. Here we can segment the bladder and fine-tune our collecting systems if necessary. Let's select the bladder. I like to use the region growing tool to segment it. I select it by right-clicking on the ROI tool menu or pressing 3 repeatedly. Now I drop a seed inside the bladder with the left mouse button. Raise the minimum threshold until it looks pretty good, like this. To get the rest of the slices, simply hold Ctrl and left-click inside the bladder. That looks pretty good. 3D region growing and other types of segmentation are covered in another video in more detail. Our segmentation is done and we can look at the results, but before doing that, let's quickly check our segmentation. This step is very important for consistent results. The way I like to do this is to select the window leveling tool by pressing 1 on the keyboard and adjusting the brightness and contrast until I can easily see the uncovered edges of the kidneys. I make sure that I have a relatively even coverage on both sides and poles. If I see uneven coverage, I will adjust by either moving the threshold slider for that kidney, redoing the segmentation, using a different ROI tool to segment, or a combination of these methods. In our example, there is no perfectly correct way to segment the lower pole due to functional inhomogeneity. For example, at this brightness level, I could think that I need to include these bits. However, at this level, it looks like I shouldn't. Keep that in mind when looking at the numerical results. Let's click the page navigation button or press Ctrl 4 to go to the plots page. Here we can look at the enhancement curves, excretion curves, and PATLAC plots. This is a good time to double check our PATLAC settings. While viewing the PATLAC plots, right-click on the PATLAC plots button to bring up the settings. We need to make sure we're calculating function only during the filtration phase, and that all of our poles are set to the same setting. We can do this by following 3 simple rules that are also described in the user manual. 1. Make sure Tmin is 30 to 80 seconds after contrast injection. In our case, we have 10 pre's, as shown here, and our Tmin for the right is 15, so that's okay, since time point 15 is 50 seconds after time point 10. 2. Make sure that Tmax is 40 to 80 seconds after Tmin. For the right, we have a Tmax of 20, which is once again fine because it is 5 time points or 50 seconds after Tmin. Finally, 3. Make sure all poles have the same Tmin, Tmax settings, since we have no way of knowing the absolutely correct setting, only relative. Here we can see that the left poles are different. In this case, I will adjust the left lower and upper poles to match the right. And that's it. We're done. This step demonstrates one of the limitations of the PATLAC model, but needs to be done for reliable functional results. Let's move on to the tabulated results by clicking the page navigation button or pressing Ctrl 5. Judging by the enhancement curves we saw earlier, we expect to have relatively symmetric function per unit tissue between the right kidney and left upper pole, and severely degraded function for the left lower pole. That's exactly what we get. PDRF, or PATLAC differential renal function, is less than half for the left lower pole relative to the rest. Remember that this is the measure of the function per unit tissue, independent of the volume of the kidneys. If you want to include volume in your functional calculation, look at the number below that, VP-DRF. When we factor in the volume, we can see that the contribution from the left lower pole is even less. This is the number that is most closely related to split function you get from a MAG3 scan. Be sure to watch that video too if you're interested. The last thing we have left to do is to fill in the callus-seal transit times, CTT, and renal transit times, RTT. Let's go back to the analysis page by clicking the page navigation button or pressing Ctrl 3. I like to get these values by looking at a subtraction MIP. Let's do that. Change to window leveling mode by pressing 1 or clicking on the window leveling button. Let's get rid of the overlays by dragging the overlay opacity slider down to 0. Now, right-click on the image and select Subtraction to change to subtraction images, which we're already viewing. Press M to toggle the MIP. Now I can hold Ctrl and scroll to watch for CTT and RTT. Here, we can see it on the right. Right-click on the ROI selection buttons to bring up the excretion menu. Click CTT for the right. Keep scrolling until you see a ureter. Here we go. And click RTT on the right. The green color indicates that the values are set. We can right-click on them to erase them. Let's do the same for the left upper pole. Here is CTT, and here's RTT. Let's repeat for the left lower pole. I can only see the calyces and hands. I don't see the ureter. This means that RTT is longer than the 8-minute dynamic, so we will leave it blank. We would need to look at the delays, if there are any, to possibly get the RTT for this patient on the lower left. Let's go back to the results page. Now all of our values are filled in. Let's save the analysis by pressing Ctrl S so we can recall it later. Let's also generate a report to send to PACS. Select Save MRU Results from the File Save menu. The program will save all tabulated results, functional maps, segmentations, and MIPS into separate DICOM series. Now that it's done, let's take a look. Go to the Local Studies page by pressing Ctrl 1 or clicking Local Studies in the Views menu. There are 7 newly generated series. You can rename them and change the series number if necessary by double-clicking like this. The first series has the tabulated results and functional plots. The next is the color PATLAC maps. Next, we have the color blood volume maps, where you can see the vessels and renal cortex well. Next, we have the ROI overlays. Subtraction MIPS. Subtraction temporal MIPS. This one is good to check for crossing vessels, since you see all enhancement phases on one image. And finally, we have a 3D subtraction projection. We can select the series and send them to a PACS server. This is described in more detail in another video. The main analysis is done, but let's look at some more advanced features before ending the video. First, let's look at some histograms. Go to the Curves page by pressing Ctrl 4 or clicking Curves page. Switch to histogram mode. By default, we're looking at raw signal intensity. Scroll with the mouse or drag the slider to change the time point of the histogram. We can change the histogram type. Let's look at an enhancement histogram. We can also look at a PATLAC function histogram and many others. As with all plots in pMRI, you can export the raw data to Excel by pressing Ctrl C. You can now paste this PATLAC histogram or any other plot into Excel. Let's look at some 3D volume projections. Let's go back to the analysis page. To make a volume projection, we first need to change the image orientation to freely rotating. Press space to switch between axial, coronal, and sagittal planes until you get to the rotating plane, denoted by the letter R next to the map type. Press M to make a MIP. Activate the rotation tool by right-clicking here and selecting it or pressing 2 repeatedly. What's cool is that we can change the map type in 3D. Let's change the image to subtraction. Now, hold Ctrl and scroll to change the time. We can change the color scale for better viewing. Press Ctrl M to toggle a temporal MIP. We can look at the blood volume map this way too. Double-click the image name to reset our images back to the default. Next, let's make a functional 3D rendering of this MRU. First, we need to generate some functional maps as a basis for the 3D reconstruction. For MRUs, I like making them out of blood volume maps from the bidirectional model mixed with subtraction MIPS. First, let's go back to the PATLAC blood volume map and adjust the mapping threshold to clean up some of the background. Control right-click on the threshold slider to change the mapping threshold. As I raise it up and recalculate the maps, you can see the background noise going away for cleaner-looking images. Now, I can make the bidirectional model blood volume map. It's this one. It takes a little longer to calculate, that's why I like to adjust the mapping threshold beforehand on the padlock blood volume map. We can see a status percentage in the top right while the map is being generated. Now we have everything ready to make the 3D render. Right-click on the image again and select 3D surface rendering. Let's change what's being rendered. First, I'm going to zoom out a little by scrolling with the mouse wheel and optionally holding space while scrolling for faster movement. I'm going to make a subtraction temporal MIP in place of the signal intensity surface. I select delta signal intensity MIP from the drop list and set the time range to be towards the end of the MRU. Hit enter in the ISO value text box. Let's lower that a little and press enter again. That looks better. We can change the color and opacity too. Let's make another surface. This is why we calculated that blood volume map earlier. Turn on surface 2 and select 2 compartment alpha from the list. I like to start with an ISO value of 30 and adjust from there. That looks pretty good. We can now see our ROIs and excretion and arterial phases in 3D. Let's add the venous phase. Toggle surface 3 and select 2 compartment K1. I like to start with a value of 0.5 for this map type. That looks pretty good. Now let's make a DICOM series out of it. Select File, Save, 3D Rotation PNG. Once the rotation is finished, let's go to the results page and select screenshots. We have a bunch of stuff here already from when we saved the analysis earlier. Let's scroll down and select the new 3D screenshots. Right-click and select Save DICOM Series. The new series appears next to the rest and can be renamed and sent to PACS. I like to call these MRU 3D Functional Map, like this. This video was a bit lengthy, but I hope you're able to see all of the potential ways to look at an MRU. Your MRU APM value, or MR Urograms analyzed per minute, will increase quickly after a few cases. Mine is pretty high. I hope this video was helpful, and feel free to contact me with questions. Thank you for watching.